A young soldier enters the presidential palace, not with a ballot, not with a speech, but with a gun. In a single day, the destiny of 23 million people changes, and no one knows what's coming next. The streets erupt in celebration. The flag changes. France is told to leave. Cameras catch crowds shouting his name. Ibrahim Traoré, just 34 years old. Some call him the next Sankara. Others call him a dictator in disguise. He promises a revolution. He swears he'll end terrorism, reclaim the country's gold, arm the people, restore democracy, and throw out every trace of colonial influence. Within months, the French military packs its bags. Their base is empty. The West watches in shock as Russia slides in quietly, flags replacing flags, soldiers replacing soldiers. There are no debates, no elections, just a new kind of silence. The violence doesn't stop. In some places, it gets worse. Villages burn. Entire regions vanish from the news. Aid workers speak of hunger. Mothers whisper of missing sons. Journalists go silent, not by choice, but because silence is safer. The government bans coverage, blocks access, labels critics enemies of the state. Promises fade. Questions rise. Is this revolution, or just a rerun with a new actor? No one voted for this. No one knows what happens next. But everyone is watching, or they were, until the world stopped paying attention, and the people were left to live with the consequences. That's the story I'm about to show you. And I promise, it's not the one you think it is. More than 4 decades after Thomas Sankara's assassination, a new name echoes across Burkina Faso. Not from elections, not from institutions, from a coup. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. In 2022, he wasn't famous. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even in his country's top military leadership. Just a captain. Trained. Disciplined. Quiet. But something was boiling under the surface. A country collapsing under attacks. More than 40% of national territory lost to armed groups. 2 million people displaced. Schools shuttered. Markets abandoned. Fear becoming normal. The government had promised security. It failed. The people protested. The military responded. First with a coup in early 2022, led by Lieutenant Colonel Damiba. That didn't work. Attacks kept coming. More towns fell. The hope that came with Damiba's takeover began to crumble. And then, suddenly, Traoré made his move. On September 30th, 2022, he and a small group of soldiers marched toward the presidential palace. No warning. No statement. Just power seized in broad daylight. Damiba was out. No bullets fired. No resistance left. On state television, a new face appeared. Young, serious, and unapologetic. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a soldier who'd had enough. He blamed the failures of the past on complacency, foreign dependence, and cowardice. And most of all, on France. In his first major speeches, Traoré promised 5 things. He would eliminate terrorists and French interference, reclaim Burkina Faso's gold and wealth, arm the people for self-defense, and return the country to democracy. 5 promises that electrified the nation. Crowds flooded the streets. Traoré posters waved beside images of Sankara. People danced in celebration, calling him a savior. But many didn't stop to ask, how exactly would a 34-year-old captain deliver what entire governments had failed to? Foreign diplomats were cautious. Analysts raised concerns. But the youth saw a fighter. Someone who didn't wait for permission. Someone who took action while others debated. And action came fast. Traoré kicked out the French military. He suspended all French agreements. Military convoys were ordered out. Diplomatic ties were slashed. Overnight, France's 130-year grip on Burkina Faso shattered. But that left a void. And voids never stay empty for long. In the background, another power moved quietly, offering weapons, training, security, and no questions. The people still cheered. But something had shifted. And while the headlines spoke of sovereignty and revolution, other stories began to surface. Stories of censorship, disappearances, villages caught between militias, journalists forced off air, a nation that looked freer on paper, but more silent in reality. Still, the scoreboard was up. Traoré had promised 5 things. The world watched to see how many he could deliver. This was just the beginning. The promise that carried the most weight, the one that gave him instant credibility, was security. Traoré stood before his nation and said the war against jihadists would be taken directly to the enemy. That under his command, Burkina Faso would reclaim every inch of lost land. No more apologies. No more excuses. He didn't just talk. He acted. Within weeks, military offensives ramped up. Checkpoints appeared across the country. Airstrikes targeted remote camps. Government reports spoke of liberated towns, neutralized threats, victories claimed in every direction. Propaganda videos flooded social media showing soldiers cheering, hoisting flags, reclaiming schools, embracing villagers. The narrative was clear: we are winning. But on the ground, it was messy. For every town secured, 2 more were attacked. Armed groups weren't retreating, they were adapting, disguising themselves, melting into the population, attacking in smaller, faster units, blending terror with information warfare. They didn't need to win every battle. They only had to make the government bleed slowly. And it bled. Civilians began fleeing en masse from central and northern regions. Markets once bustling with trade were reduced to ash. Teachers stopped showing up to schools. Aid convoys were ambushed. Entire stretches of road became death zones. Despite official claims of success, violence spread, not just in size, but in style. More random, more brutal, more unpredictable. But Traoré refused to back down. His next move was unprecedented. He turned civilians into soldiers. He launched the VDP, Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. The logic was simple: arm the people, and they will defend themselves. Tens of thousands of civilians were recruited. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, given a few days of training. A weapon, a uniform, a new identity. They were told they were the final line between order and collapse. At first, it worked. In some villages, these volunteers did protect their homes. They knew the land. They knew the faces. They spotted enemies before the army ever could. They responded faster. They were motivated by something deeper than orders. They were defending their families. But it didn't take long for that system to crack. Volunteers began settling old scores. Ethnic tensions, personal rivalries, political grudges, all were now armed. Accusations replaced trials. Gunfire replaced warnings. Entire communities were labeled collaborators and erased overnight. Human rights organizations tried to speak out. Many were silenced or banned. Worse still, the military was accused of turning a blind eye, or even supporting the chaos. The line between order and revenge blurred. And while this unfolded, another silence grew louder: the silence of the press. Independent journalists found themselves pushed out. State media controlled the narrative. Foreign outlets were banned. Coverage of attacks became inconsistent, vague, or non-existent. It was no longer about winning the war. It was about appearing to win. But the numbers kept leaking. Civilian deaths rose. Displacement climbed past 2 million. And regions that were once only threatened by insurgents now feared their own defenders. The 5-point plan was still on paper, but the ground told a different story. And through it all, Traoré stood firm, appearing at military ceremonies, speaking with confidence, repeating the promise: we are reclaiming our country. But behind him, the country was becoming unrecognizable. The war was no longer between the government and terrorists. It was between control and collapse. And one promise down for remained. They called it the boldest move in modern West African politics. With the stroke of a pen, Ibrahim Traoré severed military ties with France, a country that had dominated Burkina Faso for over a century. French troops were ordered to leave. Military bases were shut down. Cooperation agreements were torn up. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a purge. Crowds erupted in the streets, waving flags, burning colonial symbols, dancing around departing convoys. To many, it was the first taste of true sovereignty. No more outside orders. No more dependency. No more puppet strings. But as the smoke of celebration cleared, something else filled the vacuum. Within weeks, Russian flags began to appear, not officially, not loudly, but unmistakably. Wagner operatives were spotted at training grounds. Russian aircraft landed under tight security. Government officials gave vague denials, claiming technical cooperation with friendly nations, but the pattern was obvious. Burkina Faso had not replaced domination with independence. It had traded one master for another. The signs multiplied. Russian-language classes were offered to security personnel. Unmarked foreign soldiers began training VDP forces. Moscow praised Traoré in official statements. In turn, Burkinabe media outlets, now heavily monitored, echoed narratives favoring the Kremlin. The French were painted as parasites, the Russians as liberators. And while this was happening, gold exports were being restructured. Traoré announced a revolutionary move. Foreign mining firms would now sell part of their production directly to the state. A new national refinery was established. Control over gold, one of the country's most precious resources, would return to the people. It was a powerful message. But behind the scenes, deals were struck with Russian-linked companies. Mining rights were quietly transferred. Contracts shielded from public view. A new elite emerged, tied not to old colonial wealth, but to the new foreign power operating in the shadows. For everyday Burkinabe citizens, the promised benefits didn't materialize. Prices rose. Bread lines grew longer. Inflation accelerated. The gold was being controlled, but it wasn't feeding the people. It wasn't building hospitals. It wasn't creating jobs. The mines were more productive than ever, but their wealth felt further away than before. And while the economy trembled, so did the region. In a matter of months, Burkina Faso formed a new military alliance with Mali and Niger, two other countries led by juntas, also friendly with Russia, also hostile toward France. Together, they called themselves the Alliance of Sahel States. It wasn't just about defense. It was about defiance. The three countries pledged mutual protection. They threatened to withdraw from ECOWAS, West Africa's economic bloc, and hinted at forming their own union. Nationalism surged. Speeches grew bolder. Maps were redrawn in speeches and strategy rooms. But while generals met in conferences, families in rural Burkina Faso dug shallow graves. The insurgents hadn't stopped. They'd adapted, grown more ruthless. Some began mimicking government uniforms. Others infiltrated local defense units. Trust, the core of any civil protection, dissolved completely. In some areas, villagers couldn't tell who was protecting them and who was preparing to kill them. As alliances grew louder on the world stage, reality grew quieter back home. Schools remained closed. Farmers abandoned fields. Aid workers were kidnapped. Infrastructure projects stalled. And rumors began to spread that Traoré had no intention of giving up power. That elections would be delayed, again. That the promises were just tools for consolidation. But nobody dared say it out loud. Not anymore. Because with the new power came new fear. Journalists disappeared. Critics were labeled agents of destabilization. Social media accounts vanished overnight. Foreign NGOs were expelled. And within the silence, a different kind of regime began to take shape. One built not on stability, but on control. And yet, the image of revolution persisted. Flags flew. Chants echoed. Pan-African murals were painted on walls. But for those watching closely, it was no longer a question of whether Traoré was keeping his promises. It was a question of whether he ever intended to. And still, the clock ticked. Toward the next delayed election. Toward the next economic report. Toward the next unexplained explosion in a northern village. The revolutionary had become the ruler. But the revolution was still waiting. It started with a speech, calm, calculated, and full of fire. Traoré stood before the cameras and declared the formation of a people's army. Not a professional military, but something more radical. Every village, every town, every able-bodied civilian would now become a soldier. It was framed as empowerment. A defense of the people, by the people. The Volunteer Defense Forces, the VDPs, were no longer a small experiment. They were now a cornerstone of national security. Tens of thousands of rifles were distributed. Training camps sprung up overnight. Propaganda filled the airwaves, glorifying sacrifice, unity, and vigilance. Young men, some no older than 15, lined up to defend their families. They were promised honor, pay, and protection. But what they were handed was chaos. There was no standardized training, no chain of command, no legal accountability. In a country already fractured by ethnic divisions, fear, and suspicion, arming civilians at this scale was like pouring gasoline on dry brush. Soon, accusations began. In the north, entire communities reported being harassed, interrogated, and assaulted by VDP units. In the east, minority groups were driven from their homes, accused of harboring jihadists. Videos surfaced, shaky, unverified, showing blindfolded villagers, forced confessions, disappearances. But the government dismissed them as foreign propaganda. By now, Criticism itself had become dangerous. Journalists who investigated these claims vanished from airwaves. Civil society groups were labeled as destabilizers. International observers were denied access to conflict zones. The message was clear. The revolution was no longer up for discussion. And amid this silence, the fifth promise died quietly. The return to democracy, once scheduled for July 2024, was officially postponed. Due to insecurity, the junta announced the transitional period must be extended for stability. But it wasn't just delayed. It was redefined. New draft constitutions circulated, removing term limits. Election oversight bodies were dismantled. Opposition leaders were surveilled, harassed, or arrested. The dream of a quick transition, of a people rising and returning power to themselves, dissolved into vague language and indefinite timelines. And yet, the world said little. With France gone, with Russia in, with the region caught between coups and conflicts, the international community adopted a careful silence. Statements were concerned, watchful, monitoring developments. But action? None. For Traoré, it was a blank check. He now ruled a nation of 23 million, with no opposition, no independent press, and no election deadline. A soldier in his 30s, now dressed in presidential power, backed by a narrative of revolution and a militia of the people. But beneath that surface, beneath the flags, the chants, the murals, were numbers the government wouldn't read out loud. 2.5 million displaced. Thousands dead every year. An economy in freefall. Entire regions abandoned. And a silence louder than any explosion. This was not the vision the people were sold. It was something else, something older, darker, more familiar. A regime built not from the ruins of colonialism, but from the raw materials of unchecked power. Yet still, the crowds cheered. Still, the portraits of Traoré were raised. Still, the slogans painted him as the savior of Africa. But behind closed doors, even his allies whispered questions. Was the revolution real or rehearsed? Was the enemy external or already in the palace? And how long could one man hold the weight of a nation's pain before that weight buried him too? The answers weren't in the speeches anymore. They were in the silence that followed. Thank you for staying with me to the very end. If you're still watching, it's because you care. You care about the truth. You care about stories that matter. And you care about seeing through the noise to understand the real forces shaping our world, not just what headlines tell us. Not just what powerful people want you to hear. I don't make these videos for clicks. I make them because someone has to. Because behind every promise made by a revolutionary, there's a family waiting for water. Behind every military parade, there's a child who hasn't been to school in 3 years. And behind every headline you don't see, there's a truth no one wants to touch. That's what this channel is about. It's entertainment. It's exposure. It's accountability. It's standing in the shadows where others won't go and turning on the light. Every script I write takes weeks of research. I dig through documents. I cross-check every claim. I track censorship, corruption, silence. I watch, even when the world stops looking. So if you're tired of empty narratives, if you're looking for content that goes beyond the surface, if you believe that stories like this must be told, then subscribe. Right now? Not because I said so, but because these stories won't survive without people like you watching, engaging, and spreading them. Comment below. Tell me what you think. Do you believe in what Ibrahim Traoré is doing? Do you think military rule can ever deliver democracy? Do you think kicking out one superpower only to invite another is progress? Or a trap? And most importantly, share this. Share it with your friends, your group chats, your social feeds. Because right now, someone else is only seeing one side of the story. You could be the person who changes that. This is more than a video. It's a movement toward truth. Subscribe, like, comment, share, and I'll keep doing what they hope no one ever dares. Asking the questions that matter, digging where others won't, and giving you the full story every time. See you in the next one.